And I'll turn it over to our wonderful alumni participants.
Great. Well, thanks, Laura, and thanks to the 55 of you that have joined here. Hopefully, this is worth your time. And the first thing that I'll say before we get into introductions is this is your time. So we want to make sure that you get as much out of this as possible. So ask questions, stop us as you go through. We've got a big chunk of time at the end of this that we're holding for Q&A. So be percolating on those questions as we go through, if you don't want to interrupt us, but we very much would appreciate the engagement. Frankly, it's more interesting for us the more that you engage. So with that being said, I'm Jeff Clothing. Laura mentioned I'm a 2005 Colgate alum. I am currently a managing director and partner with LEK Consulting. I'm based in LEK's Boston office. My path from Colgate was into first a boutique consulting firm outside of New York, focused on incentive program design and competitive benchmarking for banks for about 5 years. I came back up to the upstate New York area, got my MBA at Cornell, and then have been with LEK now for about 8 or so years. LEK, if you're not familiar with it, is a strategy and M&A focused consulting firm. So the majority of our work is working with CEOs or boards on big questions, typically primarily around the topic of growth. Within LEK, I focus on our industrials sector, which is pretty all-encompassing. LEK has 4 major super sectors of focus. Industrials is one, healthcare is a second, the third is consumer, and the fourth is media, tech, and entertainment. So maybe I'll turn it over to Pam next here to introduce Fahrenheit 212.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, all. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces too. A few people from the last session who I got to chat with. So it's really, really great to see you guys again. My name is Pam Duncan. I'm a 2014 grad and took a little bit of a winding path to innovation consulting, which is what I'm in now. So right after graduation, I went into the arts. I worked at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, on their external affairs team. It's the coolest job I'll ever have. I was on the special events team, so basically raise money for the museum through those events. After a few years, knew I didn't want to do that, but didn't know what I wanted to do. Enter consulting. It's a great option to explore what sorts of things you like. I went into management consulting at first, so I have experience on that end at Capgemini Consulting. And actually, as I was doing that search, I was connected with Jeff like five or 6 years ago now to chat about that. He was so helpful. So it's funny how these Colgate worlds come back together. And I was in management consulting for close to 3 years, realized that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. And it was only then, like 5 years after Colgate, that I discovered what innovation consulting was. And so I've been working pretty closely with Laura and David to help Colgate students while you're still in school or recently having graduated, learn about what innovation consulting is, in addition to management consulting. I've been at Fahrenheit, which is an innovation firm, for close to 2 years now. We have 2 teams at Fahrenheit, the Magic team, which is idea development, and the Money team, which is commercial strategy. I'm on the Magic side, but our thinking is that on every project that we do, we have people on Magic and Money on the same project so that we get both sides of the brain working towards the same solution. That's Fahrenheit, and that is me. And I guess Kyle, now I'll turn it over to you. And you are in mute, Kyle.
Zoom.
6 months into quarantine and you're still doing that?
I'm still getting it wrong. But I graduated in 2017. I actually went to work for an asset management firm, BlackRock, and I did that for just around 2 years. And then came over to LEK, so kind of a non-traditional path, kind of similar to Pam. Yeah, and I'm a generalist right now, but hopefully I'm kind of starting to focus on industrial. So hopefully working with Jeff and that team. But yeah, happy to be here.
Terrific. All right. Well, I'm going to try to put something up on the screen here. And can folks see this? Yeah. Okay. All right. So there were just a couple of pages that we wanted to share to set the scene here. And we have about, I think, 90 minutes together. Just went through some introductions, but as I think Laura put out here, we want to help you understand, what is a management consulting case interview, what are the firms looking for, and what does it feel like? How do you be successful in that process? And then the third, bullet here is we want to actually do a mock case interview. And I'm going to thank Kyle in advance for volunteering to do this. It's pretty nerve-wracking to do a case interview in front of 55 people. So we'll be kind to him when we go through that process. But good on you, and thanks in advance, Kyle. We're going to take a little bit of time after that case to do a little bit of debrief, and maybe this is the first time that you've seen a case actually done. Maybe it's not, but what are some reactions, and we can talk about what went well or what worked from that to give you a feel. And I'll pull out, maybe Pam can do the same, some things that jumped out, and some reactions to give you a sense of how the interviewer might be thinking about how that individual might fit in with the firm as they're going through that case process. The next is, Pam's going to take us through an innovation consulting case interview example, and I think she actually has some output of what a great example looks like. So it's a very different process where you have, I think, a week, and there's a very dedicated, specific output at the end of it. So there'll be two different types of case interview processes that you'll get an experience and exposure to over the course of this. And then we've got, maybe something like 20 or 25 minutes at the end for questions that, may come out. So here's the plan with how we wanted to use the time together. So I'll take a little bit of time. I'll try to keep this brief of, what is a case, why go through it, and I'll start with the mechanics. What is a case interview question, and what does a case actually look like? So it's generally about 30 minutes in duration. It's a one-on-one discussion. There are about 5 different components to a case. The first is the interviewer will present a prompt to the interviewee. It's typically some type of a business problem. The second is the interviewee will go through, ask some questions, probe a little bit more, make sure that they've got a good understanding of what the case context and issues are about. And then they'll take a little bit of time to think about and develop a structure. It's often 60, 75 seconds where it's actually quiet. And you've got often a piece of paper in front of you that you're sketching your thoughts onto, developing we'll call it structure. And then there's a dialogue that ensues for about 15 minutes where you work through that structure to actually solve the problem and ultimately get to a recommendation, which might be at the very tail end of that process. So this, is the general, archetype of what a management consulting case interview, a live version of that might look like and feel like. Why do it? What's being tested? It's a way to evaluate whether or not you could see yourself working with this individual on a real problem. Oftentimes, these consulting case interview questions are a 4, 8, 12-week project condensed into 22 minutes. They're never going to be as much as you're going to cover as you went through in the original project, but there's a good sense to test analytical ability and horsepower, commercial judgment, because you often have to navigate through making various quick decisions as you're navigating through the process. In some cases, there's a lot of data. What do you do with all of that data? Poised under pressure. Nobody ever has the answer kind of going into it, and you're often faced with some ambiguity. How do you handle some of that, questions that you might not necessarily be expecting? And ultimately, could you see yourself working with the individual as you're working through the problem? Could they potentially fit on a case team? The good litmus test of is consulting potentially the right fit for you is if you go through this process and there's a little bit of sweat, right? But it's healthy sweat. And if you like it, that's a good sense that you might be a good fit for consulting. If it's, you go through it and it's a really, really challenging, difficult experience, it is a sense that you might not necessarily fit as well with your personality and what you're looking for. So it's a good thing to think about. There are a couple of attributes that interview consulting cases test: analytical horsepower, leadership qualities, commercial judgment. These are the types of things that are looked for. So how do you do well? There are a couple of tips here on the next 2 pages on, what can you do to really ace the case? One is making sure that you really understand and internalize the case question. If you go off and you answer the wrong question, it typically doesn't go into a very good place. Make sure that a really thoughtful, probing question can actually be a really significant differentiator for an interviewee. So really internalize and think about those questions. A good structure matters a lot. Can you create buckets that are, a term you may have heard, MISI, mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive? Is it going to address all the issues, and are they discrete, buckets in the way that you might structure? Pursuing the critical path with urgency. You don't have a lot of time on a case, and there's a whole lot of rabbit holes that you could potentially go down. How do you get to what the most urgent areas are for you to solve the case and pursue it with urgency? What is what we call critical path? Talked about commercial judgment. You often have to make different decisions. How do you justify why A and not B, C, or D? Communicate precisely. A lot of times when you're going through these cases, there's language that's used, and Kyle will show this in a moment. There's language that's used that's specific to an industry or a problem. You want to be able to understand, internalize, and play that back and communicate that to guide that discussion. Analytical shortcuts, round numbers. A lot of times there are different, there are different ways to shortcut some of the quantitative components of a consulting case interview. Be on the lookout for those. Be coachable, take cues. It's often a dialogue. It's not a monologue, right? Where one person is just driving it. In a lot of cases, the interviewer wants you to be successful, and they're going to give you some cues and they're going to coach you a bit. Take those cues. Have a recommendation. If at any point during a case, you want to be able to pull up and have a recommendation for what you would do. You're never going to have all the information you possibly want. If you go through this for 18 minutes or 15 minutes or 12 minutes or 22 minutes, be able at any point to be able to get towards whether you think the answer is, blue or if it's red. And have a conversation. It's not meant to, there is a lot of structure that's in and around the consulting case interview process, but at the end of the day, it's a conversation. It's not a, let me work through the mechanics type of a process. And there's a quantitative component to a lot of this. So some tips on, how to prepare, practice mental math. There are resources out there. I know that Laura and Dave could point you to these as well to help with this. There's a lot of different types of methodologies. Segmentation is an important part of it, and you'll see some of this when we go through the live case interview. Always, you will kind of lay out your approach first, go through the logic portion of it, and then you plug in the numbers. It's not necessarily just jumping directly into numbers. And practice. You can find these types of case questions everywhere. If anybody knows how many slices of pizza that Slices sells each night, that's a case question. You could probably use some logic that helps to figure that out. and it might be somewhat time and seasonal dependent. So in any event, there are a couple of tips and things that you can do to prepare for these cases. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of preparation. It's too late to think about practicing case interviews when you get the interview. So I've put a timeline up here of, it really does take a commitment. If there's one thing that I was going to leave you with here is, if you're interested in consulting, whether you're interested in consulting or you're not, going through the case interview preparation process will prepare you for any interview. It may or may not be a consulting case interview process. But it does take commitment, and it does take live actual cases to find ways to practice, whether that's with roommates, consulting club, other peers that are interested in consulting, alumni like us, the Career Services Center. You have to begin to think about a path to getting to double-digit number of cases before the interview. So there's some numbers up here, but the point is start early and practice. It does take a commitment, but it's worth it. Okay. So I think that's everything that wanted to share from a preparation point. Maybe I'll just pause briefly there, and Kyle, Pam, anything you would add to those quick rundown on tips?
I would just say when you're preparing, I think there's a lot of resources out there where you can kind of do self-practice for case interviews, but the one thing I learned is that there's really you really have to get the live reps with somebody sitting across from you. So I would just all those resources are great, case in point. I know there's a bunch of different things out there, but there's nothing that can really replace doing live cases. So I just encourage you to get someone else that's interested. Or I drag my roommates along and had them do it with me a couple times a week. Just get the live reps.
There are 50 other people that might be you on this Zoom call right now. Yeah. So you have to be creative, but it's worth it. Okay, so maybe open it up. Any initial reactions, questions before we get into the live case, or should we just jump into the live case? All right. Well, let's jump in. All right. So I'm going to give a case to Kyle. This is an actual project. This is actually my very first project at LEK when I was a brand new consultant in 2012. So this comes from an actual project. So Kyle, the client is a $600 million producer of interior thermoplastic components to commercial airframe OEM. So, think about the last time that you walked onto a plane. Now, everything that's on the inside of that plane that is based in plastic, whether it's the side panels, the stow bins, the window reveals, the overhead passenger service units, our client made a lot of those components and they sold them to aircraft OEM. The aircraft OEM, they're building brand new aircraft that the aircraft OEM or original equipment manufacturers are selling to airline companies. And those airline companies are taking those aircraft and they're operating them. So they primarily served the new market, right? So they're primarily serving the original equipment manufacturers for airframe. And the question that they had for us was, whether or not they should enter the aftermarket for the types of components that they already make. So selling directly to the airline companies when an airline company, for example, needed to refurbish their aircraft over the course of the life of that aircraft. So, two questions for you here, Kyle. One, how would you structure an approach to figuring out whether or not the aftermarket would be an attractive market for our client to get into? And if so, how might you think about what types of considerations, such as pricing, that might be needed to take into consideration before getting comfortable with that decision?
Okay, so let me just make sure that I have this all down. So our client is a $600 million, is it revenue? $600 million revenue company? Okay. So $600 million company, and they produce thermoplastics, which are like the interiors of commercial airplanes, so exclusively commercial. So like the interiors of commercial airplanes, anything that's plastic in there, they produce. And right now, they primarily deal with the new market, and they sell directly to OEMs, and then the OEMs put it on the plane, and then they can sell it to the commercial airlines. And what they want to know is should we enter the aftermarket market? And now we're going to be selling directly to commercial airline companies. And their question is, should we do this? Is that all? Okay.
Yep,
Actually,
correct.
1 second to just gather my thoughts.
Yep.
Okay, so I think the first thing, so what I would do is try to look at I think that like we want to look at the revenue opportunity, and then hopefully get a feel for what the profit opportunity is like. So within the revenue opportunity, or to evaluate the revenue opportunity, first thing I would need to know is something around volume. So I don't know if thermoplastics are replaced often, or if they're replaced almost never at all, or why they're replaced. So we'd want to know a little bit more about that. Then we'd want to know about pricing, and if there's any like different customer or commercial airline segmentations that might be relevant with pricing. And then we would need to kind of understand like what the competitive set is, and maybe get some type of assumption around what market share we could look at reasonably. And then I would move on, I think, to evaluating hopefully like the total profit opportunity to understand, is it really worth it? And that would be just around the cost to produce the thermoplastics. And then there might be a few other considerations, like I know it's a new customer set, so something around that where they haven't really served this customer base before. But I think primarily it's going to be the revenue opportunity, and then understanding the profit opportunity that's tied to that.
Okay, sounds good. So whether or not this is a market that's going to be able to move the needle for the client is an important consideration. We're $600 million. Is this going to be big enough to be worth the squeeze? Mm-hmm. So if let's start, for example, on the demand side, if we were trying to figure out what the annual market opportunity for the types of components that we make, how might you structure an approach to figuring out what that size might be?
So first, I think we'd start with, the first thing I want to know is like why these things are replaced. Like, are airlines typically just doing it when it's end of life of however long the useful life of thermoplastics are? Are they doing it for some other reason to upgrade? So we want to understand a little bit more about that. Then I have to know, would like to know the volume of airplanes that are out there, so we can get an understanding of if X% of airplanes, of commercial airplanes, are going to be replacing each year. How much volume does that represent? So that would be the first, or the portion I would be looking at. So I guess, do you have any information for me there? Like how many airplanes are kind of in the relevant set?
Yeah, that's a good question. So globally in operation, there are about 50,000 aircraft that are in operation. Half of them are military or cargo, so they typically don't have interior thermoplastic components. The other half, which is addressable to us, is the commercial passenger side. Of that commercial passenger aircraft in operation, we have the tooling, right? Tooling is what allows you to make very specific components. We have the tooling for about 42% of those aircraft in operation. And you raise an interesting point about the replacement cycle. It's not as if you're replacing window reveals and overhead passenger service units all the time. So the useful life of an aircraft is typically about 20 years. And when the thermoplastic components that our client makes get replaced are generally about every 7 years. So
Got it. Okay.
let me ask you a question, Kyle. So if based on that replacement cycle, how many aircraft, or what percentage of aircraft in a given year are actually up for refurbishment?
Got it. Okay. So if there's useful life in aircraft is 20 years, replacement cycle for thermoplastics is every 7. So an airplane is getting a brand new thermoplastic set in year 0, and then they're replacing at year 7. Then they're replacing again at year 14, and then the airplane's being decommissioned. So it would be two replacements over the lifetime of an aircraft. And I'm just thinking, if I have 20 aircraft and they're evenly distributed with age, that would be so we have one airplane that's brand new, one's 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, up until 20. So it'd be 2 aircraft that are replaced out of that set, 2 over 20, so 10%. So 10% of airplanes are going to be replaced, are going to have their thermoplastics replaced every year, about 10%.
And so if you were going to convert that 10% number, Kyle, to the actual number of aircraft that are refurbished, what would that be?
Of the total commercial passenger, or just the subset of that we have the tooling capacity for?
Good clarifying question. So of the subset where we actually have the tooling to be able to create, so what is truly our addressable market?
Okay, so we have 25,000 commercial aircraft, and we can replace 42% of those we have the tooling for. So 40%, so 10% of 25,000 is 2,500. Times 4 is 10,000. 1% of 2,500 is 250. 42, it's 500. So about 1,000, or sorry, here, 10,000. Sorry, so it's 250. 2,000, 10,000, yep, 10,500. So 10,500 is our kind of like the addressable customer. Oh, no, sorry, yeah. So it's 10,000, we have the tooling for 10,500 airplanes. And 10,500 times 10% are going to be replaced each year. And that's going to give us about 1,050. So 1,050 commercial aircraft each year.
Okay, so 1,050 each year, and you made a point earlier about competition. Right now there are a handful of third-party competitors out there that serve the aftermarket. They're called PMAs, or parts manufactured approval companies. They make engineering equivalent components to the original, but they're not the original. They're a third party. And they tend to compete a bit more on price. But for an OEM certified component that an airline company knows came from the exact same provider for the original aircraft, those OEM certified component providers actually can earn a bit of a premium. So there's a pricing option that we have here. Number one is we could price at the premium level of about, let's say, $600,000 per ship set. A ship set is basically one of every component that you need for a single aircraft. If we do that, we think we can get about 16% market share. If we price in line with the price, the PMAs, they are about 40% lower than that $600,000 number. And if we price in line with the PMAs, we think we could get actually about 32%. So, two questions for you here, Kyle. One, what is the revenue opportunity if we were to pursue pricing strategy A versus pricing strategy B? And what else would we need to think about before making a recommendation as to whether pricing strategy A versus pricing strategy B is the more attractive option?
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I have pricing A and pricing B down. So pricing strategy A we would be charging $600,000 per ship set, and we would plan to take 16% share of, like 60% of that 1,500 number. Okay, and then PMA pricing is option B, and that's going to be 40% discount to the OEM pricing, and that's $360,000 per ship set. And we would be willing to get, or we would be planning to get 32% share with that strategy. And we're looking to know, you're just looking for what's the size of each of these opportunities?
Yeah, those two questions. So the first one is, what is the revenue opportunity for the company if they were going to pursue A versus B? And what are the other considerations that you would need to understand before you were able to make a decision about whether A or B is the right option?
Got it. Okay. Just 1 second here while we have 600,000. Sorry. So 16% share. So 1,050. And I guess, yeah, so 16% of 1,050. 10% is going to be 105. 5%. 5% is going to be half of that, so about 52.5, and then 1% is going to be 10.5. So 105, 157.5, 168. All right, so 16% share, you're going to have 168 planes. And then we're going to multiply that by 600,000. All right, so the opportunity. 1 second. Okay, so that opportunity would be about, it's $100.8 million. So opportunity A is going to get us $100.8 million. All right, opportunity B is going to be 32%, so double that share. So 168 times 2. That's going to get us 336. And we're pricing at 360,000. So that is going to get us, just check 1 second, 336 times 360. So that opportunity is going to get us around 120 million.
Okay.
We're around 121.
Okay.
All right. So the revenue opportunity is bigger with the PMA discount pricing. And that makes sense. So we're doubling our share, but we're only coming down 40% with price.
Okay. So the option B is a greater revenue opportunity, but what are the other factors that you might want to take into consideration before being in a position where you could recommend whether A is better than B or vice versa?
Yes, I think we're making more revenue with the PMA pricing, but I mean I can just see it's not double the revenue, but we're selling double the ships. So the cost considerations that like the implications on cost of like doubling the volume of our products sold, that would be something I think we need to know. So something around costs and what the cost structure looks like.
Yeah, it's probably significantly higher margin on option A. Yeah.
Yep. Sorry.
What else?
And this is to evaluate one versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
So the price and the margin contribution, I guess like our I guess we have to reach more customers with the PMA pricing. So there'd be a higher sales cost, like in addition to the cost of goods sold cost, there's gonna be a higher sales cost.
Yeah. I mean, let's putting the cost aside for a moment. What other considerations might be important in thinking about this?
Just the problem is the whole, or the choice between these two, or whether or not to enter the market as a whole, or the in between these two segments.
For the moment, the pricing decision.
I don't know. I mean, I think
we're selling to airlines, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we're selling to airlines.
We probably don't sell to airlines today.
No, yeah. If we don't sell to airlines, we don't have the relationships. There might be an investment that we'd have to make to like build our brand with the airlines.
Yeah, it's a completely new customer set. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So if we don't have the relationships, have to invest in our sales and our brand and our advertising. I guess if we're now bypassing the OEMs with a product that they used to sell, there's the implications on that with our current partners and our current customers are now being bypassed. That could obviously cause friction.
Yeah, there could be some channel conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
With not necessarily being very pleased with us if we're going around them to sell to their customers.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that, so the conflict with like our current primary customer set, the fact that this is something that we've never done before, or at least it's a customer set that we've never sold into before. And then there's the cost implications that we talked about.
Sure.
I think those are like the main three things that come to mind.
And it is still $100 million opportunity where we don't really need much in terms of our production. So Kyle, let's take a step back, and let's say that you're with an LEK team. You're in the boardroom. The LEK team gets up and goes to lunch. The CEO comes in and says, Kyle, I'm excited for this meeting here. What's the answer? What do you think we should do? Should we get in? Should we not? How should we price it? What would you say?
Mm-hmm. I would say that it looks like both revenue opportunities are significant, are going to move the top line. The PMA pricing option definitely appears to be more attractive right now, just from a pure revenue size perspective or revenue opportunity size perspective. But there's a couple other things that we might need to know before making a recommendation one way or the other. And that would be what the cost structure looks like, or what our profit pool looks like in each segment, or potential profit pool. The potential for conflict with our current customers, the OEMs. And then also the fact that we've never sold in this segment before. So there's probably going to be some upfront investment that's needed to build the brand, advertise, into sales and marketing, just to enter a new customer segment.
Terrific. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
All right. So end of the case. Kyle, maybe I'll ask you first. What was your experience like? How did you think it went? What do you think went well? What would you have done differently?
Good. So I think it and something that always tripped me up in cases is like, and this is I think difficult for everybody, but it's just like staying organized throughout and trying to remember all the details of what the interviewee is saying to you. So I wish that if I could go back, I would kind of like slow it down, like make sure I have a structure laid out, make sure that my notes are a little cleaner so that I can remember like what each of these segments are. Like at the end, I totally forgot what was PMA, and I kind of forgot what the other segment was, and honestly, what the PMA segment, right, like who those customers were. I just kind of had them defined in my mind by their different, by like the different price structures and the different share. So I think it's helpful to keep like those qualitative things in the back of your mind because you can get a little tripped up with follow-up questions if you're not like really keen on those details. But yeah, honestly, I wish I kind of rounded the numbers, like or at least asked if I could round those numbers because it can get a little difficult when you're working with 16s and 32s and 100 or 1050s. So I think that's always something to keep in mind, right? It's Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you like ask if you can round, I know my first case interview that I did at LEK, I didn't round the numbers and it got me down a bit of a rabbit hole. So if you can ask that, I think that's always really helpful. It can help it just be a lot cleaner. Yeah, I guess what would you think? Any feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I thought you did a nice job. I think that you went through the structuring process and had a number of key things that you wanted to think about up front, which was great. I think you did a nice job on the the quantitative portion and working through laying out what your big buckets of approach were going to be before you dove right into the numbers. So you created a plan, developed a plan, and then went through the kind of analytical portion of the exercise. I think that you wrestled with some very good, more holistic considerations at the end, right? One option might have a higher revenue and it's a bigger number, but that might not actually be the answer, because when you take a step back and you think about the implication on the margin opportunity and some of the differences in terms of whether or not we're set up to do this now or not, those are all pretty important. So I thought you did a nice job. I think the one thing that I would say, encourage folks at the end to do is to, at the end when there's a recommendation, take a position, whether it's yes or if it's no, and the reasons why. There's no right answer, or for what you've uncovered, will lead you to one answer, might lead you to a different answer. But be able to say, yes, I think based on everything I know now, I would do this, and here's the 3 reasons why. That was the kind of the one thing. I don't know if I explicitly heard you say you would or you wouldn't go in at the very end.
I was teetering a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
It was a yes, but or not even a yes.
It was a yes, but. Yeah. Yeah. But thank you for Kyle for going through that. It's it might be. Is this your first time going through a case with 50 people online?
It's the first one. Maybe. We'll
so thank you for doing that.
No problem.
Maybe open it up to others. Anything else that jumped up, or reactions, or things you thought Kyle did well, or that was going through your head as you were seeing Kyle go through that case interview?
Yeah, actually, at the very beginning, one thing I don't know if this is common practice, but to ask for additional objectives in addition to the case you're given. I would think that would determine the trajectory of how you go about the case and how you take the notes and structure everything.
Yeah, it's a good, Braden, it's a good point. Usually the case prompt does have the primary objective, but it's always good to, ask, is that the only objective? Because, there may be something else. In this case, it was, I may have said, yes, they want to figure out whether to enter or not, and they want to find a way to grow, and they want to find a way to grow, profitably in a way that doesn't impact their base business. And maybe that gives you a little bit of extra color to know how to develop your structure.
like what if Kyle brought up a question about like, is this tool company or replacement parts company also looking to capture more market share? Like, would a question like that have been relevant, at least to this case?
Well, I think in this case, because the case was all about the aftermarket,
Mhm.
where they didn't have any share, versus their core market, which was the new market. It would be, how do we gain any share? Should we enter to try to gain share in the aftermarket? Where a question like that might be applicable is if they are a small shareholder in something, and it's a question of whether or not they should try to gain their share there, versus some other action.
Okay.
What else? Any other reactions? Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
So I had a question for Kyle. So Kyle, you said that when you were answering a question and throughout the whole process, you forgot some of the details. Is it bad to ask the person interviewee, like, could you repeat that, or does that seem like you're not paying attention or anything like that?
No, I don't think so at all. Like I wish, if I'm looking back, I wish I did that. Like when you're asking a clarifying question at whatever point in the process, if you're stumbling and hung up like I kind of was at the end, I think it's totally fine to ask, like, hey, like kind of forgot what this term meant, or what give some characteristics of this segment. Like, could you redefine that or say that one more time? I think that's totally fine.
Thank you.
But I'll defer to Jeff.
Yeah,
he
no, I
gives
would
these-
agree. It's totally fine to ask. Taking notes well in these sessions, you should go into them with 10 sheets of paper,
Mhm.
5. And keeping organized, and everyone develops their own way to go about it, but it might be, one page has the question, your structure, and then as you get into the dialogue, you might move to your second page. And, this case had a couple of different components to it, right? There was a prompt and a structure. There was a, size of aircraft component, which might be it might be its own page. There might be a pricing decision and another considerations page. Maybe you've got one page that's for scrap math to do your, it's not like we're doing long division, but, different, components that are just, kind of scratch that you don't necessarily want on your clean note pages. So, figuring out what works for you in terms of the process of how you go about those notes can help you to if you write in a clean way, it helps you to stay organized mentally too. So it can be a really useful tool to go through the case interview process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Mo. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? So the main question was whether this company should enter the market, and how I see it. You started off by looking at the demand, then at the competition, and then at the pricing decisions. So is this a journal template that can be applied to like most of the consulting interviews?
No. Often there are different structures that work depending upon the problem and the prompt. There are frameworks that are good to become familiar with, but you can find these on all kinds of case prep interview sites. But think about them more as, they're kind of tools and they're arrows in the quiver, right? You might pull one out and tweak it for a particular case interview, and the next case interview might be something completely different. And that's very, very normal. So depending on the case, what you might use to crack the case might be a very different tool, a very different structure.
Okay, thank you.
It's very important to try to tailor your structure in the way that you might approach it to the very specific case question that's being asked. Good. Yep, Zach.
So I have a question about how you would self-grade yourself. Earlier you mentioned you should practice, get some reps even with your roommate. How do you, with your roommate, maybe they're not, the consulting, how do you kind of evaluate yourself and how you did? And then also too, is it a universal process, like do certain firms kind of ask a certain type of questions, or do other firms ask different types of questions, or is it pretty standard throughout?
There are different types of questions. And, one of the reasons why reps are important is because it gives you more exposure to a broader set of potential problems that you might face. But I can guarantee you, when you go into a case interview, you're never going to have heard that question before, for the most part. You might have heard something similar, right? And you could put it into a bucket, but it doesn't necessarily, prep helps you with more poise in being able to approach a problem and what's more ambiguous. So it's more about that. It's not as if one firm only gives one type of case and another firm only gives another. Actually varies a lot by just the individual interviewer as well. So you can't really practice to the test, if you will. It's more about how do you develop those skills that will put you in a position where no matter what gets thrown at you, you've got the highest chance of being successful. Yeah. We've got
Yeah,
to
stop.
at the end.
Zach, on your last question there, the tail end of that, it was like a lot of the case consulting books, even if you're doing it with a roommate, they give like a template for like review and how you did. So I don't think they have to be somebody that like really is keen on looking for the details, because there's a pretty well outlined and explicitly outlined like way to evaluate how you did in that case.
Yeah. But it's subjective, ask, ask your roommate, start to, one of the things that I did when I was going through the case interview process was, after a case, I would say, what are the 3 things that I thought worked well? And what are the 3 things I would have done differently? And actually like take 10 minutes after a case and write it down. You start to be able to become self-aware and be able to almost course correct yourself. But you should also ask whoever you're interviewing with. And depending on if they've never done a case before or if they're in consulting, the degree to which that perspective is going to be a little bit different. But I would think about it from both angles. So what I might suggest, maybe just in the interest of time, I want to turn it over to Pam because that was management consulting. Innovation consulting has a very different interview process, and I think we want to give you a sense of both. So Pam, over to you.
It is quite different, and I was having a little bit of PTSD as I was listening and watching that, because I went through that management consulting case process, and I was in management consulting. And Jeff, to your earliest point, when you said that these case interviews are a mutual selection moment, where yes, LEK or Fahrenheit or whichever firm is interviewing you to see if you would be a fit with them, but it's also your moment to be interviewing this industry to see if you like thinking in this way and if you like solving these sorts of problems, and be really tuned in to how you're feeling. Because I was kind of having the heart palpitations listening to that I had when I was actually doing my management consulting interviews. And I remember after the interview, I ended up getting the job, but I remember going back to my apartment after and just collapsing on my bed and falling asleep. And it was midday, but it just so exhausted me because it wasn't the way that my brain worked. But that's not to say that your brain doesn't know how to do a case. It might just not love management consulting cases or love innovation consulting cases, because as you're about to see, they're quite different. So they're different in a lot of ways, but the biggest way is that in innovation, let me stop. Innovation consulting is consulting, it's project-based, but the questions that we answer for our clients are about how to make something better or how to make a new thing. So for the example that Jeff and Kyle just walked through for that plastic supplier, that company might come to a company like Fahrenheit and say, not should we go into this one part of the category, but instead they might come to us and say, we want to grow. How? What should we do? And it's a total blank slate. So we might tell them, partner directly with the airlines. Or we might say, forget about the aerospace industry entirely. Schools, like that's what needs plastic, whatever. Or forget about plastics entirely. So that's kind of the kind of projects, the kind of thinking that you do in innovation consulting. And the actual cases for our interviews are take homes. So what will happen, I'll share my screen. View. Okay. I think you can see, right? Yes. Okay. So what will happen if once you get to the case interview stage at a company like Fahrenheit is you'll be emailed a packet, a case study packet. And it's, it'll be a little PDF packet with maybe 10 pages in it. And it will include the brief, so the actual problem that you're being asked to solve. And it will include some project background, the different tools that you need in order to solve that. And then just some additional support information. And this is additional color, similar to the color that Jeff peppered in when Kyle was asking questions, but you don't have somebody to ask questions to. So it's preemptively providing you with this color. And the most important part of this case is the brief. So it'll be the slide that contains the brief. This was actually mine that I used for my Fahrenheit interview. And just I'm going to break down ways to look at what this brief is, kind of like the alarm bells that should go off in your mind. And then I'll show you what I actually put together. A caveat though, before I get into all of that, the brief that I'm going to show you was for somebody who was on the magic side, so decidedly more on the creative idea development side. I know that most people on this call are either recent grads or currently at school. So at Fahrenheit and in innovation consulting in general, when you first start, you come in as a generalist. So for the intern or analyst cases, your case would touch both on the idea development portion and the commercial strategy portion. But I was going for magic specifically because I was an experienced hire. So mine was on just that idea development side. So an example of a case that you might be emailed, because this is what I was emailed, would say something like this. Our client is Lowe's Home Improvement, the competitor to the Home Depot. And the project background in a nutshell is that they see urban as a huge opportunity, not just the suburbs, not just rural anymore. They see big cities as a big opportunity. So they have come to us, they've come to Fahrenheit, and they want to know how they can grow in cities. Is essentially, breaking down all of the mumbo jumbo in that brief is what they want to know. What my assignment was, or what your assignment might be at an innovation firm, is this. Generate 3 notions based on at least 2 of the hypotheses. And they give you clues. So this is what a notion is. It's a Fahrenheit term. A notion is basically an idea. What's a hypothesis? This is all included in the project background. So inside your case is all of that additional, all of those questions that Kyle asked in the live interview is being provided to you in your case packet. So generally you have a few days, often a week, to put this case presentation together. And then you will present it out to whoever is interviewing you. The thing to note though, is that, and the only reason that I knew this is because I knew people at Fahrenheit, but it's not just a matter of putting slides together that touch on 3 ideas. You're putting a full deliverable deck together. So I think mine ended up being 60 slides, and they ask for 3 notions. And so here's one notion that I put together. This is one of 3, But in order to get there, I went through maybe 10 slides of some introduction. I go through 15 slides of support research to show how I got there, because so much of what we do in innovation consulting is to tell this story, that we have to show the client that, you know, in the month that it took us to put this Notions portfolio together, you know, we went away, we got really smart on your company and your category and your channel. And here's proof that we did that. So it really validates all of the ideas that come after if we can include all of this support up front. Yes, so some things to touch on, and the reason I want to, and I'll chat more about it after, but I want to show you what this end deliverable ended up looking like, because I think the standard is a lot higher than I thought it would be. I mean, had I not known people at Fahrenheit, I wouldn't have known that this was the standard that they were going for. But it's really to show that on day one, you'd be able to hit the ground running with kind of putting something like this together. So that's the first piece of advice, is put time into it. That's the first thing that we're looking for. I mean, same thing in management consulting. It's a client-based business. So when the client closes their laptop and goes to sleep, they're paying us a premium to keep cranking and to keep working. And so in this industry, a lot of it is a grind. So show that you have that grit, show that you can grind. So, and show that you can be kind of creative with it is a little bit of sparkle that's added for innovation consulting, I think. So all of this I put together to show all of the research that I did to better understand Lowe's. I spoke with consumers. These are all Colgate grads. You might maybe recognize some of them. Kyle, I think he's the only person who might have overlapped at all. But you know, I prove here to whoever's interviewing me that I spoke to people across the country. I visited a Lowe's location and I spoke to Jose and Harold and Gerard. I got quotes from these people. I spoke to this woman, Julia, who was at the Lowe's. You know, I went there and I was talking to the customers there. I called Lowe's to see how their customer service associates work. So in doing all of this, it kind of helped me with the notions I landed on. But the reason in the interview process that I really did this was to show how much I cared. Yeah, this was my apartment a few apartments ago, but I did my own ideation workshop, you know, in my apartment with the sticky notes. And I include photos to get credit for this time that I've put into it. So that's the first part, is put in the time. You're given a week, so take the week and show that you care. You'll probably have about an hour to present, and be ready to present, but also be ready to not present. So I had this whole 60-page presentation put together. I had practiced my presentation, and then I sit down with one of the partners at Fahrenheit, ready to go. And he had received the deck a few hours earlier. So he just said, can you just flip to slide 17? That's a slide that I want to talk to you about. And I wasn't expecting to talk about the other 13 notions I had put together. I remember the brief was to focus on 3, but Marcus wanted to see how I behaved under pressure or when there was a bit of a pivot. Because my presentation, you know, we showed this on slide 17, and then on slide 18, I said, you know, 3 notions rose to the top, and then I was ready to go into them in the following slides. But Marcus wanted to say, he said, actually, we'll get to those in a second. Out of these 16, tell me about one of the notions that you said no to and why. And maybe he wants to see my logic. I think part of it, he wanted to see how I called down. But I know that the other big part was that he wanted to see if I was actually able to speak to something that I hadn't prepared to speak to. And I did. Super Trooper, I remember, was the one that I spoke to, and it was an idea that I had cut, but I told him why it was the one that I might have brought in if I had been able to bring in 4 notions. That's the second point, is to be prepared to present, because unlike management consulting cases, you are given a week and then you have an hour time slot, and that's your hour interview, and they're expecting a presentation. And to Jeff's point, even with the management consulting one, is to remember what that original ask is. So you remember all the way back up in the brief, it was put together 3 notions. Lowe's wants to know what those 3 ideas should be. And so here is one of them. And I knew this format because I had spoken to people at Fahrenheit. So I knew what they were expecting, but even if you don't know people at the company, it's logical. It's common sense. My brief was to tell Lowe's 3 ideas that could allow them to increase their market share in urban environments. So those are my constraints that I have. And then I know that every idea that comes out of that has to fall within those guardrails. And then, so for each of these notions, I put together a little story of, on the consumer end, what the problem is, on Lowe's end, what the problem is. Here's the name of the notion. Here's what it is. Here's what it might look like. Bringing it to life for the client a little bit of, we could expand it. We could have something called the basics bar, whatever. Why the customer should care and why Lowe's should care. And then an analog of another company that's done this. And we use analogs so much in innovation consulting because everything that we're suggesting to the client is new to them. And it's scary. New stuff is scary. So to make things less scary, we show how other companies or other organizations have done something pretty similar in a different category and been successful there. It gives the idea a little bit, allows it to hold a little bit more weight than even before. So, and then like the full deck is back here. I'll pause there and say that this was a case more on the idea development side. For somebody who is an intern or an analyst and you're interested in innovation consulting, your cases will ask 2 things of you. They'll ask for the idea generation, what I just showed, like here's an idea and here's how it might come to life. But it will also ask for you to consider the commercial side of things. So it'll ask you to size this idea. And by size, I mean to tell Lowe's how much money they might be able to make from that. And your numbers don't have to be right. That's not the point. The point is to show that you, 1, thought to size it, and 2, how you went about it. And there's some pretty creative ways of going that I've seen people do. So I think at a very high level, that's what to look for. And then on the Fahrenheit side, some things that I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you guys. On the innovation consulting side, some things that the companies are looking for. Do you care? So that first point of put in the time. We give people a week and let's see what they do with that week. So that's the first thing, is do you care? And we've seen people get really creative with showing that they care. I remember one intern or analyst who I was interviewing, the case was Subway, the quick service restaurant, and they sent Subway delivery to the 3 interviewers, the person who was interviewing, to like eat Subway while she told us about her Subway case. So show that you care. That was just one small example of that. The 2 is the actual presentation skills. Is that client ready? In innovation consulting, every single innovation firm is pretty small. So I know in the Fahrenheit office, at Fahrenheit, I think we have 150 people globally. Most of them are these pretty small boutiques, which means that from week 2, maybe, like kind of as soon as you're put onto a project, you are in front of the client. We have all of our interns in front of clients as well, which means that that situation where Kyle was left in the room as the rest of his LEK group went out to lunch and the CEO asks him for his opinion, that happens. And we need to be sure when we're interviewing that that's an okay situation with whoever we're interviewing. So do you care? Do you have client-ready presentation skills? And then the third is the content. So looking both at the ideas, at the data analysis, to see the thought that was put in there, the creativity that was put in there, the logic, with a caveat that some innovation firms, and Fahrenheit included, view themselves as the teaching hospital for innovation. So this belief that creativity is not innate, it is something that can be learned and can be taught by somebody who is open and able to learn. So we place a tiny bit less emphasis on what the actual idea is and more on how they got there and what that deliverable actually looks like. And then from the content point of view, we ask questions throughout or at the end, and those are questions that the person hasn't been able to prepare for. And what we're looking for is what that thought process looks like. And this is the bit that's kind of similar to these management consulting cases. We won't ask them as, you know, the questions as should go down that rabbit hole of specificity like Jeff and Kyle did, but we'll be looking for a point of view. So that's typically the question we end on of these 3 ideas. Imagine you're talking to the CEO and she asks you which idea Lowe's should go after. What do you tell her? So come in, you know, with this point of view is one question, but we also tend to pepper in questions that aren't about the case. So be ready for those other behavioral or more industry type questions. So we'll ask something like, is there a company who is doing something really cool that you're really excited about? And what and why? And just kind of see if this is even an industry that person is interested in, because yeah, I think we're really looking for that mutual interest on both sides. So that was, I hope, a coherent, high-level overview of what an innovation consulting case might look like. Would love if you have any questions to answer them, or anything that I said that you want to hear more about or didn't quite make sense, or anything like that.
I have a question.
Sure.
So once you got your case study and they gave you what your question is going to be, how did you, I feel like if I got a question like that, I wouldn't really know where to start. Like, how did you start researching? What was the first thing that popped into your head? Because it seemed like you probably did like some traditional research, but you also went and talked to people who actually worked at these stores and you interviewed your friends. How do you recommend once someone gets a question like that, how do you start?
Yeah, so I sat with it for a day. So as soon as the email came in, opened it up, read it a few times, read it out loud, tried to repeat it to somebody without reading it to like really be sure that I got it. And then I didn't do anything for a day. I just sat with it and let my like deep brain kind of work on it and just let it sit there for a sec, but not for too long because I only had a week. So then like, let me go back to this brief. So then I pull out a few things that I know from this brief. So I know that it's Lowe's. I know the guardrails. I know it's Lowe's. I know that they're focused on urban. They had talked about last mile delivery. So the first thing that to do, and then the research will start to fall out, like the ideas will start to fall out, is learn about the company. Like, go to Lowe's website, see where are they. If I go to locate a Lowe's, if they're in the city, what are the store hours? Like, you're a consumer, and that's the cool thing, that in innovation consulting, it's entirely consumer focused. So imagine you want to go to that Lowe's and it's on the Upper West Side, but you live in Brooklyn because you're in your 20s and all of your friends live in Brooklyn. And why isn't there a Lowe's there? Because you're all moving all the time. Like, start thinking of it as a consumer might. What, they close at 9, but you work until 8:30. How could you get there? Like, all of these things will start. So I would say first start with the company. And then I know it's urban, so I know what category they're in. Is Home Depot also in cities? I know that there are little bodegas and mom and pop stores in cities. What kind of offerings do they have? Yeah, I think that's the first place that I start. And then I always have, even when I'm doing research, is I have a separate ideas document, because as you're Googling these things, and if you get a brief and you are able to actually go to that location, go. If you're able to get on the phone and talk with somebody, do that. Talk to somebody in the store. We always ask if somebody has done that, because again, it shows that kind of their research mentality. Yeah, so, and it's kind of one of the tests. We typically give a brief that somebody would be able to explore in a few different ways. The other thing that I will say is that I knew a ton of people at Fahrenheit, and you all know me now, and you're part of this Colgate network. So you would be remiss not to get on the phone with one of the people at that company and say, I just got this brief and they asked me to put notions together, and I have no idea what a notion is, because that's what I did. And this template that I used was a Fahrenheit template. So, and I was lauded for that. I mean, I don't know if that was just Fahrenheit being scrappy to be like, good job, Pam, you like really made the most of your resources. But so use your resources. You'd be silly not to. And I know that anybody in the Colgate network would be happy to help you structure how to go after this. Because on a real project, you never have to go after it alone. You're on a project team. So it's pretty intimidating going after it alone.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering about the research you did. Given that you only have a week, how much is like made up, or how much would it be too much to say, use your family members or friends as a fake consumer and then kind of not exaggerate, but extrapolate from like one episode they had, or split one consumer into multiple stories? Like, is that type of information, I don't want to say manipulation, or splitting it up or reorganizing okay to do when you're trying to organize the information that you have?
Totally. Also, hi, it's good to see you. No, because this brief was a 5-month brief that Fahrenheit worked on years ago, and I had a week and no team to do it. So much, most of those people I spoke with were my family and friends. Yeah, and they're real quotes that I had with them. It was just via text message where I texted and like, have you guys ever been to Lowe's? Have you ever done home improvement? Like, have you ever done home improvement? Whatever. And those count as quotes. And the point of all of these was to show, if I had the time, I would talk to a bunch of consumers. I would talk to more people at the store. It's scary just walking up to somebody in the store and asking for their opinion, so I only did it to 2 people. But it's just kind of this little sample to just give a nod to how you're thinking overall.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so in the interest of time, I just want to kind of open it up to any general questions for our alumni here. And I just want to say thank you again to all 3 of you. This has been fantastic. And I will also be following up with everyone. Like I said, probably in a few days after I've had the recording edited and ready to go to be sent out. But I'll also include some information about a great third-party resource that we offer in career services. As all of our alums have mentioned, practice is key. So we have a program, and it was actually mentioned on Jeff's slide deck, called Rocket Blocks, that we do have available to students, but it is a little bit limited in the amount of licenses that we do have. So I'll provide further information in that follow-up communication about how you can access that program if you're getting ready to really dial in and start practicing these pieces and the drills and the structures and a lot of the terms that you heard thrown around today. So I just want to open it up again for any final questions, and thank you all again.
Yeah, I just have one question. When's the given the circumstances of COVID and everything, when's the earliest case interviews or just consulting interviews in general will be conducted this year or this semester?
October for us.
What about like just in general, like whether it be a Big Four or, you know, something related to that, or?
It's all around the same time frame. Maybe Laura, you can answer the question, but it's generally starts around late September.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Usually that timeline that Jeff shared, where it showed kind of that September to November timeframe, is usually where you're going to be at as far as application, interviews, offers, etc.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Go for it, Zach.
All right. So my question is, what would you say is the biggest mistake that college kids or anyone applying for a job makes when doing the whole case interview process? So whether that's preparing or actually at the interview, but just what would you say is the biggest mistake that they make?
I think it's not preparing early enough is probably what I would say is the biggest thing that I've seen. And it's not that you need to do 100 live cases, but you need to do in the double digits to start to develop a natural fluency for it on the management consulting case side. It does, it takes time. You've got to work at it. And, I would say, and I think Kyle made this point as well, it's a valuable preparation process to go through for any interview, not just consulting. And because it shapes the way that you might think about structure as you go through other interviews. So it's not a consulting or bust. If I don't, get an interview in consulting, all that time was wasted. It's actually very useful for other, for other career paths as well.
Yeah, I'll say on the innovation side, it's because you have that week. I think it's the mistake of not fully immersing yourself in everything that you can. Like after that week, you should walk into that room as an expert in Lowe's in cities, and an expert in home improvement in cities. You certainly should know more than the interviewer. And so, yeah, it's not using that week to the full potential.
I see.
I have a question also. So knowing that most interviews will probably be taking place over Zoom or some sort of video platform, any tips or tricks for students as they're preparing for a virtual case? A lot of times when I'm working with students, we'll talk through making sure that those note sheets are really clean so the interviewer can see how you're formulating your thoughts. Any tips and tricks on how to maybe nail that piece still while over a screen?
It's a good question. In the past, I could say I've been in interviews where people are abroad, and so it is already virtual, but I don't think anyone's yet done a full recruiting season of virtual interviews. So there might be some learnings here. But what I'll say has worked well is, find yourself in a space where you're basically going through the same exercise, but emphasize the nonverbal, means of communication. You do have a video. You don't necessarily have, the ability to really truly replicate whether you're across the table, but, use the visual screen that you have. The second thing I would say is when you take that initial set of notes that has your structure on it, in a live interview, you might actually be able to spin it around and point to it with the interviewer on the other side of the table, which is harder to do on Zoom. So, one thing you might want to do is, you take your sheet of paper and you actually, hold it up. And when you're going through your structure, you're pointing to, 1, 2, and 3, and they can see and you get credit for that structure that you've put into place. Otherwise, it's not that different. You need to verbalize more, but it's not that different. The way that you prepare is very similar. The only other, third point I would make is practice over Zoom. You might be, tempted to practice in person, and there might be a different feel to it, but practice over Zoom or a video platform and get a sense for what it might be like and what works and what doesn't. So a couple of tips, but the mental preparation, it's almost exactly the same. It's a few tips and tricks around the edges.
Thank you guys for sharing. I have a question for Jeff. So I'm wondering how many rounds of interviews for LUK would there be for this fall? And how many cases and behaviorals would there be in those different rounds?
So the case and behaviorals are mixed. So there's 2 30-minute case-based interviews in the first round. The first, call it 5 minutes, is behavioral. The next 22 minutes is case, give or take. And then there's often time for a question or two at the end. One case is typically more oriented around strategy and commercial judgment. The other one has a quantitative element to it, like the one that Kyle and I just walked through. In the final round, there are 3 30-minute case-based interviews, one of which is strategy, one of which is more quantitative oriented, and one of which is around called business logic. So they're, you prepare the exact same way, but they're different flavors of cases. And typically the biggest difference between the first round and the final round is the first round might be with other associates, which are the pre-MBA role at LEK, plus consultants, which are the, very shortly after MBA. The final rounds are typically with managers and partners. So it's just a different kind of group of interviewers, but 5 total interviews, mix of case and behavioral throughout.
Thank you for that info. So 2 follow-up questions on that. So you're basically saying that there isn't like a full-on like a 20 or 30-minute behavioral. Is that correct?
No, there's not a full behavioral only interview.
Okay.
That's correct.
And also, when you said that in the final round, there would be a strategy case and a business logic case. So what would the difference be between those 2 different kinds of cases?
So generally, one is a little bit more freeform, I'll say, whereas one is a little bit more structured. And the freeform one, I like Pam's suggestion of, tell me about an industry and what you like about it. It's more like that, where it has, a lot of different paths that it could take. And it's more of a dialogue. Whereas the strategy case is a very specific question that has it has a critical path and a couple of structured decision points on it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just another follow-up question. So would all of these cases be interviewer-led?
It's often a dialogue. It's more of a collaborative discussion as opposed to the interview is going to drag you through the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Thanks so much.
And there are some interviewers or firms that have more of that style of case. Quite the for LEK, but again, you prepare for both the same way.
Okay, thank you.
Any final questions or anything of that nature? Like I said, I will be sending out further information, contact info as well. And I'm sure that any of our wonderful alumni will be happy to connect with you to talk a little bit more further about your case interview prep or just consulting in general. But I just open it up for any final questions. Otherwise, thank you all so much again. And safe travels to everyone as they get ready to head back to campus next week. All right. I think that's it then for questions.
Thanks so much.
Yes,
Thanks, guys.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.